This episode of the Zelos podcast is sponsored by Perform Better. Perform Better is the leader in functional training by supplying innovative products and top-notch education to trainers, coaches, and therapists. Check out the brand new Perform Better app, designed for professionals who want to stay on top of their game. This free app features education from the world's best. You'll learn from industry leaders including Mike Boyle, Gray Cook, Sue Falzoni, Charlie Weingroff, and many more. Topics range from strength and conditioning, program design, nutrition, business, and marketing. Just go to performbetter.com. Welcome back to yet another episode of the Zelos podcast. And I don't know if you're watching along with me, but here in Santa Cruz, water sports are part of just being here and living and being a resident, whether it's surfing and paddling or sailing. In this case, the America's Cup happened in mid-March, and Emirates Team New Zealand took it once again and maintained their championship title of America's Cup winners against the Prada Pirelli team of Italy. And it was an amazing kind of race. So much with the boat designs that have gone through the last few years. Love to talk a little bit about that. However, I'm going to be talking strength conditioning with a guy that trained Team New Zealand. His name is Dr. Adam Storey, and he has quite a prolific background in strength and conditioning, whether it's Olympic weightlifting coach, whether it's sprint canoeing, race canoeing, whether it's rugby. I mean, he runs the gamut, and he is the one that's behind creating the human machinery that won the America's Cup. So, Dr. Storey, Adam, welcome onto the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So first, I want to know, if you don't mind sharing, you were all about Olympic weightlifting, and I'd love to get a little bit more background there. But then there was rugby, and rugby and training Olympic weightlifters, and then comes the America's Cup. How did that all happen? It's not like, chocolate and peanut butter mixing together with Olympic weightlifting and sailing. But yeah, as far as I know, barbells don't do well on board boats. So how did that happen?
You did right there, Rocky. So I guess originally, weightlifting background, as you mentioned, and that was as a coach for the New Zealand weightlifting team. And really, really great opportunity for me. Like, went to 2 Olympic Games and 2 Commonwealth Games, as a result of that. And I guess that was always my passion from a young kid to watch these Olympic athletes. And it always fascinated me, obviously, the dedication it takes to get to an Olympic Games. But equally, I was always fascinated with, what was happening behind the scenes in terms of coaching and support staff and all that kind of work to try and get these athletes or teams to those events. So that was definitely the cornerstone of my life for a long period of time. And I guess with the nature of it being a strength and power based sport, then I'd often do quite a bit of contracting work to different teams, mainly rugby teams throughout New Zealand. And then after the Rio Olympics, I actually, being a Kiwi, we're absolutely mad about rugby. Decided to really, I guess, test myself in that team sport environment. And I jumped across, so I hung my coach's hat up and jumped across to become the sports science manager and assistant trainer for the Blues Super Rugby team here. And that was great. I mean, we had a number of really fantastic All Blacks within that environment. So again, for me to not only learn going from an individual to a team sport athlete, team-based environment, that was huge. But then I was very privileged to be able to learn from, I guess, some of the best, being around these fantastic All Black athletes. And I guess being a New Zealander, the other crazy thing that as a nation, we're mad about is sailing, and in particular the America's Cup. It's I guess the Rugby World Cup and the America's Cup are the 2 cups that really unite us as a nation. And it was a very interesting opportunity that came up a couple of years ago when one of my colleagues asked if I'd like to join him on board with Emirates Team New Zealand as part of the physical conditioning team. And I mean, it was, for me, I'm not from a sailing background, but as I mentioned, being a Kiwi, like we grew up watching the America's Cup, and yeah, so it was an easy answer for me to get amongst it.
So I'm getting a sense that you're a little bit younger than me, and I'm wondering how old were you when New Zealand finally took the cup away from America after I think it was 123 years running that
Yeah,
America had won the cup?
yeah,
Was it
good question.
86?
It was 1995. We actually won it for the first time. So around 1986 was when New Zealand first started competing in the America's Cup, and yeah, I can definitely remember watching those early editions, and yeah, they had the likes of Dennis Conner, and he was such a character. So yeah, 95, when we won it, I would have been best 13 going on 14 years old. And yeah, it's quite a weird thing. Like, I've always been fascinated with sport as a kid. So just one of my little things I do is I always collect newspaper articles of all the amazing things that happened. And I've actually still got the original newspaper from 1995 when we won the America's Cup. So it's got the old team on the front page. So yeah, I pulled that out the other day to show my children, and it was just quite a surreal experience to sort of come full circle, because back in 1995, I was just a screaming fan. Never ever thought I'd be involved in an America's Cup campaign, let alone a winning one for New Zealand on home soil. So it was very cool.
Truly surreal, I imagine. You just mentioned something that I don't really think about that often, but you just shed light on being a coach for a team versus individual competitions, such as weightlifting or perhaps gymnastics or even skiing and snowboarding, right? These are all individual kind of pursuits and competitions, but it's a different philosophy of mentality, and therefore it's got to be a different coaching approach. So can you kind of in short, how do you sum up the difference between coaching the individual versus coaching a team?
That's a really good question, Rocky. I think a lot of people can sort of glaze over that fact, but they are two completely different beasts. I guess with the individual athlete, I mean, the level of detail you can get down to from not only a planning, periodization point of view or data analytics is phenomenal. The level of relationship that you can get to with those athletes, again, is just out of this world. Like some of my athletes, which I coached many moons ago when they were young youth lifters, I'm still very good friends with them and part of their lives, and they're part of my lives. Team sport, just by the nature of it, there's so many moving parts. On game day in rugby, you've got a squad of 23 players, but I mean, your widest squad throughout the season's 38 players, which is small comparison to other sports like NFL. But that's 38 individuals that you've got to somehow build a relationship with across the course of a season. There's a lot going on. You've got a coaching team, which is massive as well. So I guess the skill sets are really different in teams. You need to be able to manage a lot of moving parts quickly, but also do a good job without going into too much of a in-depth approach, or else you're just going to get lost in the weeds, as we'd say here.
Yes. Now, the team that was Emirates New Zealand, Emirates Team New Zealand that just won the cup with you. The team was comprised of a variety of athletes from various backgrounds, as I recall. I mean, there were actually some rugby players, I believe, and maybe some cyclists, some competitive cyclists. I mean, you had yourself quite a medley of athletes that come together on board this boat. How did that come about? Were you in the selection process, or did they say, "Here's the team, you're in charge of strength conditioning"?
Yeah, another great question, mate. We had an absolute rat pack of a bunch. In saying that, the statistic which still blows my mind is, we had a crew of 11 sailors or 11 team members on board. Out of that crew of 11, we had 7 Olympic medalists and 35 world titles amongst those 11 individuals. And they were from different sports, as you mentioned. Like, we had Joseph Sullivan, the Olympic gold medalist in rowing from the 2012 London Olympics, we had Simon van Veldhoven, who was Olympic bronze medalist in track cycling, again from the London Olympics. We had Steve Ferguson, who was a double Olympian in swimming and kayaking, jump across. We had Marius van der Poel, who was a member of the New Zealand Army, jump across as well. So, you know, those examples of 4 guys there had no sailing experience whatsoever going into it. 3 of the 4 guys I mentioned, or 2 of the 4 guys I mentioned, Simon and Joe, had previously done a campaign in Bermuda. So they had some experience from that, but again, not originally sailors. And yeah, when we started the campaign, we did go through a trial process. So as you can imagine, you know, a lot of people would love to throw their hat into the ring and say, hey, I want to give it a crack to be a grinder. But we were very selective around who approached us and who we approached. And then once we had a group of trialists, so to speak, which again were quite select individuals, we then ran them through a series of tests just to see, you know, one, can they even hit some of these power outputs that the design team were at the time estimating would be required to get these AC-75s to fly, and 2, could they even possibly handle some of the training sessions that we were going to be putting them through. So it just wasn't a sort of one flash in the pan, you've got through the trials, you're in kind of thing. We were looking at it from a long-term perspective as well.
That's just incredible to have neophytes in the world of sailing come in and take the world championship. That's just remarkable. Now, you speak of grinders, right? And then there's trimmers, there's the helmsman, there's the navigator. There's so many different roles on board. However, they all have different demands, whether we're speaking of physical or mental. And therefore, I'm kind of curious, more than that, about the programs that you designed. Were they position specific? Were they individualized? How was it that you started creating a program on a sport that you were familiar with from a spectator perspective?
You know, it's fascinating. So, as I mentioned, I worked alongside one of my colleagues, so Dr. Dan Plews, and he's got a phenomenal background. I mean, Dan, you know, has won the Kona Ironman and he's set a course record as well. So he's, from an endurance point of view, an absolute weapon of a man. And so I was coming from the strength and power perspective as well. So we had like a really good blend of experience going into that campaign. But again, Dan, much like myself, he wasn't from a sailing background as well. So it was a very steep learning curve for both of us. Yes, I guess as you mentioned, the contrasting nature of the program is very true. Like initially we had an idea of what the demands of our first boat were going to be. And so our grinders, basically, they went through an extensive phase of a huge endurance block initially to build them up. For some of the guys, just working with that monotony of upper body grinding was just something foreign to them. So developing strength endurance for the upper body was just a huge factor. Some of the trialists had initially thought that we were after the strongest individuals, like a 1RM bench press and bench pull would be the most differentiating or critical factor. But in reality, it's the ability to, as I said, strength endurance, which is that painful spectrum where you're still working at a moderate to high intensity, but for long periods of time. That's what we were after.
Threshold.
Yeah. And then it was interesting, from our first boat to the boat that you witnessed or watched in the America's Cup, the demands from boat 1 to boat 2 became quite different as well.
In what regard?
Yeah, well, our first boat, it was, I guess, you know, the lads were describing it as being a lot more sort of threshold-based kind of work. Like, you know, some of our key sessions, for example, were like 10 by 3 minute efforts at a maximum maintainable power or a threshold heart rate. And those types of sessions kind of correlated pretty well to some of the demands that they were seeing on boat 1. And then in boat 2, what they found is that the strength and power side of it became a lot more important. One of the really good analogies that one of the lads said to me was that it's almost like you try and jump on a bench press and do like a 2 RM bench press, and then straight away you've got to jump to the floor and do as many explosive clap press ups as you can in a row, and then straight away you're back onto the 2 RM bench press, and then back to the explosive press ups, and that's happening across the course of a 25 to 30 minute race. So that was completely a new thing. So something like your power endurance as opposed to just straight strength endurance became a key training focus for us.
It's just so fascinating. I was thinking, of course, that the race was going to be a little bit shorter, but you actually include pre-race of positioning and getting to the line right at the starting gun when the timer goes off, and that in itself is tremendous amount of effort on the part of the team, just tacking back and forth and being in the proper spot right at the start line. I mean, the race is already actually going before it officially begins. I hadn't considered that. So how is it, and I don't know if this makes any difference between boat designs, because for those listening, if you're not familiar with the America's Cup, the winning team gets to design the boat with the specs for the next America's Cup to try and maintain their title. And only one team in the world will be challenging them. So what was really interesting is like Larry Ellison, when the Cup was in San Francisco Bay, which was right up the road from here, he had I think it was a tri or a catamaran with a completely different design. You guys went back to monohull with these two hydrofoils. I think they're like 1.2 tons or so on this almost hydraulic system that was mechanized to drop a hydrofoil into the water so that the entire hull will come out, leaving very little drag. And the boat itself was reaching speeds somewhere between 40 to 50 knots. Just it's mind-boggling. And to see them do these cornerings around the buoys and redirect was just so almost surreal in itself to see. So you were dealing with the state-of-the-art technology, state-of-the-art equipment, and you're getting imperfect humans to be as state-of-the-art as possible. So for those who just think that, oh yeah, we're just going to go in and work out, it's way beyond that. I can't believe that you have achieved what you have with the motley crew that won, really. So as I'm watching some of your training videos, you're using upper body ergometers. And for those listening, again, it's kind of like bicycle pedals, but for the arms. So it's a circular action. Arms are moving in opposite directions, but at the same time. Or I would say one is alternating with the other, but it's very much a grinder, just like they would have on board the boat. And these guys are cranking it out. What kind of routines did you do with those upper body ergometers for the team?
Yeah, so it was a pretty full-on training structure, and the guys would be training 6 days a week, typically around two sessions per day.
Wow.
During, I guess, and again, that's bearing in mind different phases of the year. So as soon as the guys got into big sailing blocks, I mean, that was really hard to manage the training. And I guess that was a massive learning curve for Dan and I. Like originally we had come from sports where, I mean, Dan's background, as I mentioned, Ironman, but then he spent an amazing amount of time at New Zealand rowing and was highly influential during the London Olympics campaign. So again, we're coming from sports where, the training structure is really regimented. We know when they're on the water, when they're coming off the water, when we can do training. With the sailing environments, it's different. Like, it's weather dependent. When they go sailing, and they'll be out there for anywhere between 6 to 7 hours on the water. So some days we had these amazing training sessions planned, and then we had to bin them because, on water, obviously, and rightfully so, takes priority. And then some days, and again, different for something like rowing or kayaking, where once you're on the water, you've got an idea of what the session plan is going to be like, whether it's like 10 by 1K efforts or something like that. with the sailors, you can't really get a gauge on that. You know, you get a change in the breeze out there, and it goes from being a relatively, you know, seemingly easy, should be an easy day, to being extremely taxing on the lads. So again, that can really change the structure of the week. But when we weren't in those heavy sailing periods, as I mentioned, yeah, typically 2 sessions per day. So it'd either be a gym session, a weights-based session in the morning, and then a grind in the afternoon, or vice versa. And those grind sessions would be a combination of either a lot of endurance-based work. So the endurance grinds could be anywhere up to, you know, between 60 to typically 2 hours on the grinder, which is testament to the boys' mental tenacity to stay on those handles for 2 hours. Or a threshold-based session, which is more shorter, but obviously working at that higher intensity with repeat efforts in between. So yeah, it was tough. And I guess what is really, really unique in that environment is, I mean, a lot of athletes around the world train 2-3 times a day. That's routine. But what these boys had to do, or these men had to do, is essentially they had to work a full-time job in the boat shed in between training sessions as well. And that's just part of the Team New Zealand ethos. And I've often wondered if that's the case with the other syndicates. And I mean, these boys are having to do some pretty hard manual labor tasks often throughout the day. So, you know, they'd get thrashed in the morning in the gym, get thrashed during the day in the workshop, and then try and come back in the afternoon to do another training session. So
when it came down to having 2 races a day, that was almost that was nothing compared to what they were training.
Mate, 100%. Like exactly right. Like the boys literally said, now we're into the easy stuff. Yeah, which is not often the case. Like, you know, some athletes, once they get to the point in the competition, that's where it's the metal hit, or the rubber hits the road. But these guys said, yeah, racing's easy. We're out there for a few hours. We're 7 hours. We don't have to work as much during the day because the boat's already, you can't modify the boat too much more. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
Oh, okay. You have a PhD. However, it is in philosophy, if I'm correct. Is that right?
Yeah. So PhD, I guess by default, is a Doctor of Philosophy, regardless of your subject title, which is a weird one. So I did my PhD in sport and exercise science, so exercise physiology.
Okay. Because I was thinking that, how do you take what you've learned in philosophy and apply it? But it's a different beast altogether. It's just the way in which the terminology. I get it.
Yeah, so, it's a weird one.
No, not at all. Now I understand. So you are also at this time training the canoe racing team for the Olympics, the women's and men, or is it just women's?
So I'm national lead of S&C for Canoe Racing New Zealand. So I have input into the men's program, but they're based away from Auckland, so they're in a place called Karapiro. So by default, I primarily work hands-on with the women's team, which is based here at our National High Performance Centre.
And so what is the carryover between training the America's Cup sailors and racing canoeists? Is there? Obviously, it's water-based, but aside from that.
Yeah, actually, a great question, and surprisingly a lot. So, as I mentioned, like Steve Ferguson, one of our grinders, he was, he's been to 3 Olympics. So 1 as a swimmer and 2 as a kayaker. So when he came to trial for us, and his old man, Ian Ferguson, or his dad, Ian Ferguson, is our New Zealand's greatest Olympian, multiple Olympic gold medalist for kayaking. So Steve's pedigree is very, he comes from good stock. But one of his initial comments was, when he jumped on the grinders, was he was figuring out the technique of being on the handles, and he said, it is very similar to paddling. It's you've just got to get that rotation happening from the trunk. You can't rely on just using your arms; you'll completely blow out. So there is a lot of transference over, and I've even had the kayak girls come down to base and give the grinders, grinding machines, a bit of a blat to see how they go as well. So,
and how did that work?
They they got a bit of a rude awakening to that. So it is interesting. And actually going back to our trialists a few years ago, we actually had a few other of the ex senior men's kayak team members, also trial out for the team as well. So yeah, plenty of crossover there. So though I guess those are the type of sports, whether it's rowing or kayaking, if you do retire from that, I guess you could look at grinding as a potential career path.
Oh, well, I think you've got plenty of career paths ahead of you if you ever want. But when it comes to, say, conventional training programs and the programs that you designed, whether for canoe racing or for the America's Cup sailors, what pieces did you hold on to in regards to strength conditioning, and which ones did you put aside? Were there other elements that you brought in that were more specific for their needs?
Yeah, nice. Yeah, very nice. Yeah, I guess again, for me, originally strength and power background. So,
Sure.
that was my meat and potatoes, so to speak. And then we go into these two water-based sports, and yes, strength and power definitely as a fundamental thing, like strength and power and kayak off the start position, the first few strokes, that's where it's at. Same thing with initially getting the handles turning for the America's Cup grinders, but then you get into these other spectrums, which we alluded to earlier, is around the strength endurance, the power endurance. And that was something that, weightlifters, they don't need power endurance. you do one or two reps or one-off effort. So that was something that was really, really new for me. Like where I'd done a bit of that prescription in terms of rugby, but not to this level, like not to the level where, these individuals are doing sets based on time. Like, you're doing your bench pressing for sets of, a minute or 90 seconds versus, prescribing based on 5 reps, 5 by 5 reps, something like that. So yeah, that was fascinating. But then again, with all that kind of work, and the huge one for us, and touchwood, I guess one of our our proud points for Dan Plews and I, for the Team New Zealand perspective, was that we didn't sustain any major injuries throughout the course of that campaign. And I guess from a strength and conditioning point of view, that's something we always kept top of mind. And so with all that high volume work, which is still done at a moderate high intensity, we had to really balance it out with making sure that these guys weren't overcooking themselves through overuse injuries and those kind of things.
So that's great to lead into, because I'm curious, what are the most common injury sites for sail racing like this?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was fascinating, because our initially when guys first joined the team, we would be getting a lot of issues through the shoulders, the ribs, like rib cartilages, the old sort of tennis elbow. Those kind of symptoms would flare up, and then you'd find that after a period of 1 or 2 months, once the body had become conditioned to that. Because I mean, at the end of the day, doing grinding, as I said, for up to 2 hours, I mean, that's not normal. Nobody likes that. No. So yeah, it probably took about 2 months for the body to adjust, and then once it adjusted, these boys were away flying, which was interesting. But another challenge for us, I guess, going from our first boat to our second boat, if you noticed, our positions on the boat really changed. So
yes,
our boys went from essentially a standing grinding position. So one guy on the pedestal, there'll always be 2 guys on the pedestals. One guy is by default always going to be grinding forwards, and one guy is always going to be grinding backwards. That's just the way that the grinding machines are geared. But they were in a standing position, similar to how we set up in the gym. But then in our second boat, which we used for the America's Cup, based on aerodynamics, we had the grinders, in a seated position. They were basically in these trenches. You couldn't even really call them cockpits. They were literally like trenches. And the whole purpose was to minimize air drag on those guys, so they weren't being exposed up there. So straight away they're in this compromised position of being hunched over in the pedestals. They're unable to get the same free rotation that they were getting from a standing position. So again, their bodies had to go through this adjustment period once they'd gone from boat 1 to boat 2. You know, they were getting a lot of issues through, you know, lower back positions. So it was fascinating to see.
Yeah, I can imagine a standing position, even though the arms are the primary driver with the trunk and torso rotating, you're still able to utilize a lot of the lower body, whether it's through some dynamic stability or static stability, but still you're ground based. But as soon as you go into that crouch or kneeling position, you've just taken away a tremendous amount of effort or assistance in that. So I can see how much more concentration would be applied from basically the pelvic spine on up. So because of that, when the hips and lower body kind of go on lockdown to act as some bracing stabilizer for this tremendous trunk rotation, did you have a lot within your program design, a lot of kind of hip opening, a lot of movement in the legs just to free that up? Or what was it that did you have anything like that as they transitioned into the boat that they won with America's Cup?
No, great point. Like, someday, well, we were prescribing like specific mobility sessions throughout the course of a week, and some of the guys, I guess, really did battle initially. Like our body types were quite varied across our grinding crew, I guess by default from their different sporting backgrounds. So it's definitely something we work closely with our physiotherapist Paul Wilson and trying to figure out, you know, how can we again prevent these injuries. And I guess this is a philosophy I've always had across the athletes and teams that I work with. Is if I've got two options, I've got the option of having an athlete that's 80% healthy but 100% fit and strong, so to speak, or I've got the option of having an athlete who's 100% healthy and only 80% strong and fit. I'd always choose the latter. I'd always choose an athlete that is 100% healthy, because on game day or at their event, they can always by default pick themselves up to that higher threshold. But if you're injured or you're not healthy, there's no way that you can pick yourself up. So I guess that's the approach I've always taken.
And so what do you kind of attribute the lack of injuries on the team to? Obviously, program design being a big component of it, and I'm sure there was fueling and resting and hydration being some of the major ones, but were there some elements within your program design that you could say, I think that actually was one of the big winning tickets when it came to a reduction or almost no injuries?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, from a technical point of view, I guess you could look at it from a training stress balance point of view. Like Dan was really phenomenal at monitoring the guys' TSS or training stress scores throughout the course of the campaign. So, you know, not only are we capturing heart rate and power output data from our gym and grinding based sessions on land, we're also capturing that data when the boys are out in the water for, say, 7 hours. So even though, you know, they're not, you know, you're not grinding for 7 hours straight, you're on the water. You know, sometimes you're on the boat, sometimes you're on the chase boat, but at the end of the day, it's still a stress. Like if you're out on the chase boat for 7 hours being rocked around in the sea, I mean, I've been out there, Dan's been out there on the chase boat for that long, and we're exhausted by the time we get back to land. Like we just can't wait to get back to land, and we haven't even touched the grinders. So, you know, it really gave us an appreciation of how exhausting those days out in the water are. So as I mentioned, Dan did a great job at monitoring the TSS scores of the guys, and we'd pull back the training load for guys that were really redlining it. And I guess from a holistical point of view, and this is something I learnt from the rugby environments, is just it all comes down to communication. So again, I saw it a lot in rugby environments where, you know, that you've got alpha males amongst alpha males, and nobody wants to be seen as a guy who's weak or is injured or can't complete a training session. So they'll often just clam up and not tell coaches or support staff that they're holding an injury, but that doesn't help anyone. So again, in those rugby environments, they were really great around fostering the openness to share any niggles, give us heaps of pre-warning, because you can always do a training session, but we'll modify it for you. There's nothing wrong with doing a modified session because we're playing the long game here. So that's something that we really encouraged with our sailing team as well, is just give us open communication between Dan, Paul Wilson and myself, and the lads were really good about that.
You mentioned also like team building. You have this group of various athletes coming together, some with varied levels of experience in sailing. And so what were the things that brought the team together? Were there things that you were doing or came up with, whether they were special field trip events or something within the gym or on the boat? What was it that actually brought this team together?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned the field trips. Like, we had very early on in our campaign, we figured that, hey, and this was something that we had been approached to do by some of our more senior sailors around, hey, we should organise some team building events, just to really gel the team together. And we had some great ideas in mind. For example, as I mentioned, one of our grinders has connections with the New Zealand military, so we were looking at doing stuff with them around sort of really, I guess, getting these guys in some dark places where they had to really pull themselves together and bond as a group. But unfortunately, COVID hit us and everyone else, so we had to can all that kind of stuff, and that was a bit of a red flag for me. I was thinking, geez, we've missed a real critical opportunity to get that going. And once the campaign was rolling, and you've got the boats ready to go sailing, you don't have time to do that stuff. Like, sailing takes priority, as it should. So I guess what really brought the team together was the fact that the America's Cup, plain and simple. Like, as I said, it's just something that is in the DNA of New Zealanders. And I think as soon as everyone knew that, this is what we're looking to defend, everyone just had that common goal to get in and just keep pushing until the end.
And obviously, the entire country of New Zealand was just ecstatic, and they probably are still just buzzing right now, only a few weeks later, a couple of weeks after. What is that? What is that environment like for you to know, kind of, as you're walking down the street and perhaps you're seeing people talking, or you're seeing the buzz, and deep inside you're going, yeah, I was a part of that.
Yeah, I mean, it is still very, very surreal. And as I mentioned, I've got the newspaper clippings from both our last two defences in New Zealand were 1995 and 2000, and I remember watching those as a spectator. And I always thought, wow, like, could you imagine just being amongst or in the centre of that when the boats come in and you've got however many people there were just cheering. And then so when it actually happened for us only a few weeks ago, again in Auckland, so to have a home defence was just absolutely crazy. And even these days, like, it's still relatively fresh, but we get a lot of random or strangers coming up to even myself. I played such a small role in such an incredible team, but they might have had seen me on a snippet of the TV, and there's, well done in the America's Cup, and I almost feel like a little bit embarrassed, because it's like, well, it was the boys that were on the boat that did all the work. We just told them what to do, and they did it without complaining. So I guess even some of the guys that have experienced greatness in different sports, as I mentioned, we had Joe Sullivan, who won the Olympic gold medal for rowing, and actually we had our New Zealand Sports Awards last week, and they actually did it a little bit differently because of COVID. So they didn't do the New Zealand Sportsman and Sportswoman of the Year just because there was no international competition. So they actually changed it to a decades champion. And Joe's moment when he won gold in London was actually voted as the New Zealand sporting sporting moment of the decade. Sorry, the public voted for that one. Oh. So when we sort of asked, those type of guys, I asked them, like, where does this experience rank for you? And some of their responses were like, well, clearly number one. Like, I mean, you can go overseas and you can win world championship titles and Olympic medals overseas, which is just phenomenal. But then to be able to do something like that on home soil in front of all your friends and family, that's such a unique experience. Yeah.
Truly amazing. So one other question that I'm kind of curious about, when it comes to boat design, obviously there's a tremendous amount of energy that goes into it, and it's very fine science, to the point where they were telling you most likely what the work output would need to be for the crew. But when it comes to the training room itself, were there things that were developed specifically for training them? Or did you have to perhaps recalibrate something that was already existing? Did you develop something like physical equipment or even concepts that were not there previous?
Yeah, no, we actually did. Some of them I won't be able to discuss. We'll have to keep those ones in-house. But yeah, I guess that's the advantage of having such an insanely intelligent design team, which would be the case across all the syndicates. Like, I mean, the guys that are involved in our team, Ineos, American Magic, and Luna Rossa, those guys and women, those men and women are just phenomenal. And I often joke to people, I said, there's so many problems out in the world, with COVID or every type of disease. Yet we've got all this brain power, which is just dedicated to sport. I'm sure we could, it's madness. But no, like we did, and they were really good with helping us develop. We'd come up with some crazy concepts, and they'd help us develop them. And one of them, which I can talk about, which is not too revolutionary, but I mean, a lot of people will be familiar with the watt bike. It's quite a popular training tool for a lot of team sport athletes. Just jump on the watt bike, and the beauty about the watt bike is it gives you really, really accurate power measures, and that's why a lot of track cyclists or other athletes really enjoy using the watt bike. So for us, when we had Simon van Veldhoven, who's from a track cycling background, he had done many a grueling session on the watt bike. So he was in talks with the design team there and at watt bike, and they helped us develop, which other teams were also using and helping to develop, but a watt bike grinder. So they essentially re-engineered one of those watt bikes, pulled it apart, chucked some handles on it, so then we can get some good comparable data coming up from that. And we were able to adjust the height of it so to replicate our setup on the boat. So that worked out really well. And yeah, it's interesting. Like when you're in rugby environments, as I said, the watt bike's widely used, and we often use the 6-second power test, which is just one of the default programs in the watt bike setting, and we use it as a player testing benchmark that's used internationally. So a lot of teams will often compare, hey, what's your peak power on the watt bike? What average power can you hold? And then so I had a lot of ex and current rugby guys just asking me, hey, like, what do you reckon could I be a grinder? And I knew what their peak power outputs were from their lower body. And I was like, mate, these guys are doing more through their upper body than you could ever do through your legs. And that was literally, I wasn't being cheeky. It's literally the fact.
Wow.
And as soon as I said that to them, they were just like, oh, okay, maybe not. And that, yeah, just blew my mind.
That statement itself blows my mind, because I'm just picturing the thighs of rugby players, and to actually have a higher power output in the upper body for the sailors that's just stunning.
Yeah.
So where is the future? Obviously, we're hoping that Japan is happening. It looks like it is. So come a few months down the road, you'll be in Japan with your team for the Olympics. Congratulations on that, by the way. Congratulations on the America's Cup win. But when you reach such pinnacles of success in a career, it seems like everything else is downhill after this, unless you have some amazing goals that you haven't shared yet. So are you going to climb Everest next month or something like that?
That's funny you say that. Yeah. I was talking about Everest. It's one of my athletes a couple of months ago, and she absolutely hates the cold. So I asked her, would Everest be ever on your radar? And she said, no way. And then she asked me, and I said, I'd love to climb Everest, but no, I'm not doing Everest, or yet. I'd love to do it. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I guess, my immediate focus is definitely on Tokyo. Like, we've got a lot of pressure on that campaign there. Like, Lisa Carrington is one of our star athletes going across here, and she's currently the two-time Olympic champion from London and Rio. So she's on track to defend her third Olympic title in the K1 200. And she's also in a lot of other events with our other members of our amazing female squad. So yeah, the medal expectation there is quite decent. So there's a lot of pressure with that. And I guess, there's chat about the, when the next America's Cup campaign is going to be, whether it'll be as early as next year or 2023. So I guess I'll recalibrate to that. But yeah, it is a good question.
Well, I'll be around. I'll be watching, and maybe just have you back on, whether it's after Tokyo or after 2022, 23, hopeful victory, because I'm definitely rooting for your team. I think Americans have had it long enough, and it's nice to see it in somebody else's hands, to be honest. But Adam, this has been great. I really want to just thank you so much for spending time with me and just sharing your experiences and what you've been putting forth for the athletes. It's remarkable. And this has been a tremendous pleasure.
No, thank you, Rocky. It's been a great chat, and some fantastic questions actually coming from you. So I really appreciate that.
You got it.
And this concludes another episode of the Zelos podcast. I just want to thank Adam Storey for coming on, and tune in next week when we have John Griffin, one of the strength coaches for the Los Angeles Rams. Until then, be good, and we'll see you next week.